Well, I think obviously, Mark, the UK government was criticised very early on in the pandemic. We know almost going back 3 years now for not having kind of restrictions at the borders when we saw the first kind of wave of what we would see with COVID. But the UK is not an outlier, I suppose. You've got the Australian government as well coming out saying they're not planning on introducing any kind of restrictions on travellers from China. Their chief medical officer down there has actually cited that there's high levels of immunity across the population. Obviously, we've had a lot of infections here in the UK as well. We've had a vaccination program. So the current variants that are circulating across China are no different to the ones that we've got here. So I think the UK government's in line with some other countries. But remember, the US government that have kind of brought this in as well, they do still have some travel restrictions for kind of non-US citizens anyway. If you haven't had 2 vaccinations, you can't enter the USA as well at the moment. So I think that different countries are taking a different approach, but the UK is not an outlier by saying they're not.
Yeah, Italy has gone the other way, testing all passengers arriving from China for any type of COVID. And Lord Bethell, the former health minister, saying perhaps that is the right way forward, the precautionary principle, in case there are new mutations coming through from abroad.
Well, they'll be obviously. We do kind of have some surveillance in the population anyway, so we'll identify if there's any mutations that are going on there, and other countries will pick up as well. Some would argue, should there be a burden on the UK in terms of doing this testing? Maybe a more pragmatic approach is for everybody who's leaving China. Remember, we had to have proof of negative tests to leave the United Kingdom to go travelling anywhere. So rather than countries themselves having to actually test, the requirement for testing as people arrive, maybe there should be more of a requirement for testing as people leave. And things are getting quite bad in China at the moment. If you look at kind of, it's difficult to ascertain exactly what's happening on the ground because it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on. But I wouldn't trust the stats that are coming out of China. That's the one thing.
But isn't that the very problem, that we don't know what's going on there? What sort of variants of COVID are rampant now, as some reports suggest? And therefore, what would happen if that was released from China and into the rest of the world?
Well, that's one of the things that we will pick up quite early, obviously, from countries like the US. The UK will get criticised if something does happen quite broadly across the board here. But obviously the UK government would argue we're trying to go into that living with COVID phase. So we remember the UK is currently in its own mini wave of COVID, and COVID cases are rising across other nations. We're in that kind of winter respiratory virus season at the moment. So I think the UK government would argue that we're trying to live with COVID. We want to reduce these restrictions on people's lives that have gone in there. But you could make the equal argument, people haven't left China for a while. They've had these stringent lockdowns. But I suppose we will find out if there are any issues, because if tests are being done for other countries, we'll pick up from there. The criticism would be obviously if something did happen, why we didn't bring it in the UK.
Well, indeed. I mean, that's the very point I think Lord Bethell is making, that if we do pick up something that's a problem, by the time we get that through and it's analysed, it's a bit late.
And that's part of the criticism we had back in 2020, Mark, I suppose. So there's a reasonable argument around that. I think that, the difficulty you've got is that we want to try and have freedom of movement. We've gone into that living with COVID. I think what the China has kind of proven as well is that we've had all these kind of lockdowns across the country. I've been saying for the last couple of years is when you have a lockdown, all you do is pause the spread. Now they've decided to abandon zero COVID. COVID's going kind of rampant across the community there. So I think one of the things, you are right in terms of there probably needs to be some checks to find out what virus is kind of spreading across. Is it a different variant? The evidence to say from the chief medical officer in kind of Australia, from what he's saying that the variants circulating in China are no different to what's going on across the rest of the world. And he's going to be obviously a lot closer to the kind of the medical data than I am.
Yeah, but the issue, of course, being that China and India, to a degree, haven't got the vaccination cover that we've got, or indeed using the more modern injections than relying on the older technology, if you like.
Yeah, and China have taken a decision to kind of not use the vaccines that have been used in other parts of the world. But remember, one thing we do know is even having the vaccination doesn't kind of stop the spread of the virus overall, especially for people who've had vaccinations. Say most of the UK now haven't had a vaccination for pretty much a year ongoing there. So the vaccinations themselves won't stop that. I think what China are obviously struggling with is that they haven't got much of that immunity across their population at the moment, which is why we're hearing reports of the overwhelming hospitals, busy funeral workers, and infection soaring. Whereas you take countries like what Australia has taken a decision on, Mark, that high levels of immunity, that even if people did come in, the variants that are circulating, according to him, are no different. So that's something we probably will need to keep an eye on as we go through kind of the start of 2023.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks for joining us here on GB News. Thanks. And we'll see, of course, what emerges as that progresses.